The axe handle cracked on the third swing. Rhea Calloway stood in her woodlot, breathing hard, staring at the splintered wood in her hands like it had personally betrayed her. Which, in a way, it had. The pile of unsplit logs mocked her from where they sat in the dirt, enough wood to maybe get her through October if she was lucky, and November if God had a sense of humor. It was late September. Winter was already sharpening its teeth in the high country. She threw the broken handle into the brush and wiped her palms on her trousers. Her hands were raw, calloused in new places that hadn't existed a year ago. Before Thomas died, she'd done plenty of work around the homestead, but not this kind. Not the kind that left splinters embedded so deep you stopped bothering to dig them out. Not the kind that made your shoulders scream and your back seize up before noon. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and early frost. Rhea looked towards cabin, a squat listing structure that Thomas had built with more optimism than skill. The roof sagged on the north side. Two of the window shutters hung crooked. The door didn't close right anymore, which meant the draft came in at night and settled in her bones. She'd tried to fix it, tried and failed at a lot of things lately. Talking to yourself again? Rhea spun around, heart hammering. She hadn't heard anyone approach, which was its own kind of failure out here. Getting sloppy, getting tired. The woman standing at the edge of the woodlot was Marnie Tate, her nearest neighbor, if you counted 5 miles as near. Marnie was older, somewhere past 60, with iron gray hair and a face that had seen enough frontier winters to know exactly what they cost. "Didn't hear you coming," Rhea said, trying to keep her voice level. "I noticed." Marnie's eyes flicked to the broken axe handle, then to the unsplit logs, then back to Rhea. "You're going to kill yourself before the snow does." "Probably. That's not funny." "Wasn't trying to be." Marnie sighed and walked closer, her boots crunching on the pine needles. She carried a canvas sack over one shoulder, which she set down with a solid thunk. "Brought you some things: salt pork, cornmeal, couple jars of preserves." Rhea's throat tightened. "Marnie, I can't." "You can, and you will. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." They'd had this conversation before. Rhea hated it every time. Hated needing help. Hated being the kind of woman people pitied enough to bring charity to. But pride didn't split wood or fill an empty stomach, and she was learning that lesson the hard way. "Thank you," she said quietly. Marnie nodded, then looked around the clearing with an expression that didn't hide much. "You're not going to make it through another winter here alone, Rhea. You know that." "I'll manage." "No, you won't." The bluntness hit like a slap. Rhea's jaw tightened. "What do you want me to say? That I should pack up and leave? Go where? Do what? I don't have family. I don't have money. This place is all I've got." "This place is going to be your grave if you're stubborn about it." Rhea turned away, staring at the tree line. The mountains rose up beyond, dark and jagged against the pale sky. Beautiful and indifferent. They didn't care if she lived or died. Neither did the winter. "There are options," Marnie said, softer now. "The settlement's got work sometimes. You could—" "I'm not leaving." "Then find another way." "Like what?" Marnie hesitated, and that hesitation said more than words. Rhea had heard the whispers in town. Widow women didn't have many choices out here. You could work yourself to death, marry again, or sell yourself in smaller, slower ways until there wasn't much left to sell. "I'll figure something out," Rhea said, though she had no idea what that something might be. Marnie didn't argue. She just picked up the empty sack and slung it over her shoulder. "There's a man been asking about you in town." Rhea's stomach dropped. "Who?" "Big fella, mountain type. Didn't give a name, but Clem at the trading post said he's been around a few weeks. Stays up in the high country mostly." "What's he asking?" "About your situation? About the land? About whether you're managing?" A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down Rhea's spine. Men asking questions about a widow living alone. That never meant anything good. "You think he's trouble?" she asked. "I think any man asking questions is worth being careful about." Marnie's expression softened just slightly. "But Clem said he didn't seem the predatory type. Just curious. Thought you should know." Rhea nodded slowly. Another thing to worry about. Another problem she didn't have the energy to solve. Marnie left the way she'd come, disappearing into the trees without another word. Rhea stood in the woodlot for a long time after, staring at the broken axe handle and thinking about the slow, grinding way everything fell apart when you were alone. 3 days later, the stranger came. Rhea was at the creek, hauling water back to the cabin in a battered bucket that leaked from a crack she hadn't been able to seal properly. The work was endless. Fetch water, chop wood, try to patch the roof, fail, try again, fail better. Every day the same grinding cycle until exhaustion dragged her under at night. She saw him before she heard him. He was standing at the edge of her property line, near the old fence post that marked where Thomas had optimistically planned to expand the livestock pen they'd never gotten around to building. Just standing there, still as stone, watching. Rhea's first instinct was to run. Her second was to grab the hunting knife she kept on her belt. She did neither. Instead, she set the bucket down carefully and straightened up, meeting his gaze across the distance. He was big. Marnie hadn't exaggerated that part. Easily over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from years of hard living in hard country. He wore a canvas coat that had seen better days and a hat pulled low enough to shadow most of his face. Dark beard, dark eyes that didn't look away when she stared back. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, hands visible and empty. "Mrs. Calloway?" His voice was low, rough-edged, the voice of a man who didn't waste words. "Who's asking?" Rhea kept her hand near the knife. "Name's Gideon Hale." She'd heard that name before. Whispers, mostly. Stories about a man who lived alone high in the mountains, who came down to the settlements twice a year to trade furs and buy supplies, who didn't talk much and didn't cause trouble but had a reputation for being harder than the country that raised him. "You're a long way from your usual territory," Rhea said. "Heard you might need help." "From who? Does it matter?" "Yeah, it does." Gideon stopped about 10 feet away, close enough to talk without shouting, but far enough to not seem threatening. Smart, careful. "Talked to some folks in town. They said you've been trying to make it through on your own since your husband passed. Said it's not going well." Anger flared hot in Rhea's chest. "So you came to watch the show? See how long before I collapse?" "No." He said it simple, flat, like the idea had never crossed his mind. "Came to offer you a way out." Rhea laughed, bitter and sharp. "Unless you've got a fortune in your pocket or a miracle in your saddlebag, I don't think you can help me." "I've got a proposal." "Not interested." "You haven't heard it yet." "Don't need to. I know how this works." She'd seen it before. Men sniffing around widows like vultures, offering help that came with strings attached, offering protection that meant giving up everything else. "I'm not desperate enough to sell myself for a warm bed and 3 meals. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. Not anger exactly, more like disappointment. "That's not what I'm offering." "Then what?" He took off his hat, ran a hand through dark hair that was too long and starting to gray at the temples. When he looked at her again, his eyes were steady. Honest, if she could trust such a thing. "Marriage," he said. "Real and legal. You get my name, my protection, and a place to live that won't kill you come January. I get—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I get a partner, someone to help manage the homestead. Someone who knows how to survive out here." Rhea stared at him. Of all the things she'd expected, that wasn't it. "You're insane," she said finally. "Maybe." "You don't know me." "Don't need to know you to see you're drowning." "And you're what? Some kind of saint who saves desperate women out of the goodness of his heart?" "No." Gideon's jaw tightened. "I'm a man who spent 10 years alone in the mountains, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of talking to myself, tired of silence, tired of living like the world ended and I'm the only one who survived." He looked at her directly. No games, no pretense. "I need help same as you do, just a different kind." The honesty of it caught Rhea off guard. She'd been braced for manipulation, for pretty lies, for the kind of smooth talk men used when they wanted something. But this wasn't that. This was just blunt truth. Uncomfortable and raw. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're still fighting. Most people would have given up by now, but you're still here splitting wood with a broken axe and hauling water in a leaking bucket. That's the kind of stubborn I can work with.
This
That's the
story
kind of
was
stupid
posted
you
on the
need.
channel The Rusty
Call it what you
Saddle.
want.
Please do not
Rhea
repost
picked
it
up
in
a
any
bucket,
form.
the water sloshing against the sides. Her hands were shaking slightly and she hated it. Hated that he could see how close to the edge she really was. I don't know you, I don't trust you, and I sure as hell don't love you. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? A year, Gideon said. Give it a year. If it doesn't work, if you hate it, if you can't stand the sight of me, we call it off. I'll make sure you're set up somewhere safe with enough to start over. No strings. No expectations beyond pulling your weight and not burning the cabin down. That's it? That's it. It was the stupidest thing Rhea had ever heard. Marrying a stranger, moving to his homestead in the high country where no one would hear her scream if things went wrong. Trusting a man she'd met 5 minutes ago with her life, her future, everything. Stupid, reckless, and still better odds than another winter alone. I need time to think, she said. Gideon nodded. Fair enough. I'll be at the trading post for the next 3 days. After that, I'm heading back up to my place. If you decide you want to take the chance... He put his hat back on, adjusting it against the wind. Come find me. He turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Mrs. Calloway, I'm not a good man, but I'm not a bad one either. I keep my word and I don't raise my hand to women. That's about all I can promise you. Then he walked away, disappearing into the tree line like he'd never been there at all. Rhea stood by the creek for a long time, bucket in hand, watching the water leak out drop by drop onto the dry ground. She didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the winter coming. Saw herself shivering under threadbare blankets while the wind howled through gaps in the walls. Saw the food running out, the woodpile dwindling, the cold settling into her lungs and never leaving. Saw herself dying alone in a cabin that Thomas had built with dreams that hadn't survived him. By morning, she'd made her decision. It took her 2 days to walk to the settlement. She could have ridden Thomas's old horse, but the animal was half-starved and needed the rest more than she needed speed. So she walked, carrying what little she owned in a pack on her back, trying not to think too hard about what she was doing. The trading post sat at the edge of town, a weathered building that smelled like leather and tobacco, and the sweat of men who worked hard for little return. Rhea pushed through the door, ignoring the stares from the handful of people inside, looked up from behind the counter. Mrs. Calloway, wasn't expecting to see you. I'm looking for someone. Gideon Hale. Clem's eyebrows rose, but he didn't comment, just jerked his thumb toward the back. He's out behind the building, been working on his wagon. Rhea found him exactly where Clem said, kneeling beside a worn freight wagon, replacing a cracked spoke. He didn't look up when she approached, just kept working, his hands steady and sure. Took you long enough, he said. How'd you know I'd come? Didn't. Hoped, maybe. He finished securing the spoke and stood, wiping his hands on his pants. When he looked at her, there was something almost gentle in his expression. You ready? No, Rhea thought. Not even close. Yeah, she said out loud. They were married the next morning by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. The ceremony lasted maybe 10 minutes. Quick, efficient, legally binding. Rhea wore the same clothes she'd arrived in. Gideon wore his hat. There were no guests, no celebration, no romance. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," Gideon just nodded at her instead. Rhea was grateful. They left town that afternoon, the wagon loaded with supplies Gideon had already purchased. Flour, salt, beans, coffee, ammunition, fabric, nails, rope, practical things, survival things. He'd thought ahead, planned for 2 instead of 1. The ride into the mountains took most of the day. Gideon didn't talk much, and Rhea didn't push. She watched the landscape change as they climbed higher, the trees growing denser, the air getting thinner, the settlements falling away behind them until there was nothing but wilderness and sky. By the time they reached his homestead, the sun was setting behind the peaks, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Rhea climbed down from the wagon and looked around. The cabin was bigger than hers had been. Solid logs, tight construction, a roof that didn't sag. There was a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, a well with a working pump. Fences that looked maintained, stacks of firewood that could last through 2 winters. Everything neat, organized, functional. Everything her place hadn't been. "It's not much," Gideon said, coming to stand beside her. "But it's sound. Keeps the weather out. Stays warm enough when the stove's going." It's... Rhea didn't know how to finish that sentence. "It's more than I expected. It's better than I deserved. It's proof that maybe I made the right choice after all." "It's good," she said finally. Gideon nodded. "Come on. I'll show you inside." The interior was sparse but clean. One main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, a table and chairs, a sleeping loft up above, accessible by a ladder, everything practical and well-maintained. "You'll take the loft," Gideon said. "I'll sleep down here by the fire." Rhea turned to look at him. "You said marriage." "I did. But not unless you want it." His expression was unreadable. "I meant what I said. No expectations. You need time to figure out if you can trust me. Take it. I'm not going anywhere." Relief and something else, something she couldn't quite name, washed through Rhea. "Okay. You hungry?" She was. Starving, actually. She'd been hungry for months, rationing food that was never enough, but she'd gotten used to ignoring it. "Yeah," she admitted, I'll make something. You can get settled." Rhea climbed up to the loft while Gideon started working on dinner. The space was small but private, with a real bed. Not a straw mattress, an actual bed with a frame and blankets that looked thick and warm. There was even a small window that looked out over the valley. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her head in her hands. What the hell had she done? Married a stranger, left everything familiar behind. Bet her entire future on the word of a man she'd known for less than a week. But as she sat there in the gathering dark, listening to Gideon move around below, smelling food cooking for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rhea realized something. For the first time in a year, she wasn't afraid of winter. She was afraid of other things. Afraid of making a mistake, afraid of trusting the wrong person, afraid of what it meant to tie her life to someone else's. But not afraid of freezing to death in a broken cabin while the world forgot she existed. That was something. Maybe not much, but something. The first week was strange. They moved around each other like dancers learning a new routine, careful, deliberate, trying not to step on each other's toes. Gideon woke early and worked outside, tending to the animals and checking the fences and doing the 100 small tasks that kept a homestead running. Rhea worked inside, cooking and cleaning and organizing, trying to make herself useful without getting in the way. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was about practical things. Where he kept the extra lantern oil, how she liked her coffee, whether the chickens needed more feed. Safe topics. Easy topics. Nothing that mattered. But Rhea watched him when he wasn't looking. Watched the way he moved. Efficient, purposeful, never wasting energy. Watched the way he treated the animals, firm but gentle, patient when the old mare got stubborn. Watched the way he maintained everything around them with a care that spoke to pride in the work itself, not just the results. He wasn't what she expected. She'd expected someone rough, maybe cruel underneath the surface, someone whose silence hid darker things. But Gideon just seemed tired, like he'd been alone so long he'd forgotten how to be anything else. On the 8th day, Rhea was working in the garden plot behind the cabin when Gideon came around the corner carrying an armload of lumber. "What's that for?" she asked. "Shelves. Thought you might want some, for books or supplies or whatever." "You're building me shelves." He shrugged. Place could use them anyway. He set up near the barn and started working. Rhea tried to focus on pulling weeds, but she kept glancing over, watching him measure and cut and fit the pieces together with the same methodical care he brought to everything. After a while, she walked over. "Can I help?" Gideon looked up, surprised. "You know carpentry?" "Some. Thomas taught me basic stuff before." She trailed off. Talking about Thomas still felt wrong somehow, like a betrayal of something, though she couldn't say what. "Hold this steady," Gideon said, handing her one end of a board. They worked in companionable silence for the next hour. When the shelves were done, Gideon carried them inside and mounted them to the wall near the kitchen area. "There," he said, stepping back. "Better?" Rhea ran her hand along the smooth wood. They were simple, functional, perfectly level, made with care. "Yeah," she said softly.
This
"Better."
story was posted on the
That
channel
night,
The
Gideon
Rusty
made
Saddle.
venison stew
Please do
while
not
Rhea set the
repost it in
table.
any form.
They ate together like they had every night since she arrived, but something felt different, less careful, less like strangers sharing space and more like something else. "Can I ask you something?" Rhea said, breaking the silence. "Sure." "Why'd you really ask me to marry you?" Gideon set down his spoon, considering. "Told you already?" "You told me part of it. But there's more, isn't there?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I was dying up here. Not physically, but—" He gestured vaguely at the cabin, at the mountains beyond. "You can live alone so long that you forget how to be human, forget how to talk, how to laugh, how to care about anything beyond just surviving another day. I could feel it happening, and I couldn't stop it." He looked at her directly. "Figured if I didn't change something soon, I'd end up like those old hermits you hear about. The ones they find dead in their cabins years later because nobody noticed they were gone." The honesty of it hit Rhea hard. She'd been so focused on her own survival, her own desperation, that she hadn't considered what his might look like. "I get that," she said quietly. "The dying inside part. I know you do. That's why I asked." They finished dinner in silence, but it was a different kind now. The kind that didn't need filling. The honesty of it hit Rhea hard. She'd been so focused on her own survival, her own desperation, that she hadn't considered what his might look like. "I get that," she said quietly. "The dying inside part. I know you do. That's why I asked." They finished dinner in silence, but it was a different kind now. The kind that didn't need filling. Dirt. 2 weeks in, the first real test came. Rhea was checking the smokehouse when she heard shouting from the direction of the barn. She ran over to find Gideon on the ground, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, and one of the horses, a young stallion he'd been trying to break, bucking and wild-eyed in the corral. "What happened?" Rhea dropped to her knees beside him. "Spooked. Caught me with his hoof." Gideon tried to sit up and swayed. "I'm fine." "You're bleeding all over the place. That's not fine." She got him inside, made him sit while she fetched water and clean cloth. The gash wasn't as bad as it looked. Head wounds always bled like hell, but it needed stitching. "You know how to do sutures?" Gideon asked, watching her thread a needle. "Unfortunately." She'd done it before, patching up Thomas after various accidents. Hated it then, hated it now. But she worked quickly and efficiently, pulling the skin closed with neat, tight stitches while Gideon sat perfectly still. By the end of the first month, they'd fallen into a rhythm. Mornings were for work, separate but coordinated. Afternoons brought them together for the tasks that needed 2 sets of hands. Evenings were for meals and, increasingly, for conversation. Gideon turned out to be a decent storyteller when he bothered to talk. He told her about the mountains, about the wildlife, about the brutal winter 5 years back that had killed half his livestock and nearly killed him. He didn't dramatize or exaggerate, just told it straight, letting the facts speak for themselves. Rhea found herself talking too. About Thomas sometimes, though those stories hurt. About her life before the frontier, back east where things had been easier and harder in different ways. About the year after Thomas died, which she'd never talked about with anyone because admitting how close she'd come to giving up felt like weakness. "It's not weakness," Gideon said when she confessed that. "It's being human. Feels the same sometimes." "It's not." One night in early November, the first real snow came. Rhea woke to silence, that peculiar quiet that only comes with fresh snowfall. She climbed down from the loft to find Gideon already up, standing at the window. "It's early this year," he said without turning around. Rhea came to stand beside him. Outside, the world had transformed into something clean and white and beautiful. The kind of beauty that would kill you if you weren't prepared. "Are we ready?" she asked. "Yeah, we're ready." The certainty in his voice settled something in Rhea's chest. They'd spent the last month preparing, stocking the root cellar, cutting firewood, weatherproofing the cabin, making sure the animals had shelter and feed. They'd work together like a single organism, anticipating each other's needs, moving in sync. "Good," she said. Gideon finally turned to look at her. In the pale morning light, his expression was softer than usual. "You did good, Rhea. Getting us ready. Couldn't have managed it all without you." It was the first time he'd called her by her first name. The first time he'd acknowledged her as more than just a practical arrangement. "We're partners," she said, echoing her words from weeks ago. "That's what partners do." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding maybe, or the beginning of something neither of them had planned for. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering everything in white. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Rhea Calloway felt something dangerously close to hope. The snow didn't let up for 3 days. Rhea had experienced mountain winters before, but never this high up, never this isolated. At her old cabin, she could still see the smoke from Marnie's place on clear days, still feel connected to something beyond her own 4 walls. Here, there was nothing but white in every direction, and the two of them locked in together with only firelight and conversation to keep the darkness at bay. On the 4th morning, Gideon bundled up and headed out to check on the animals. Rhea watched from the window as he waded through snow that came up past his knees, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. He was gone longer than usual, and she found herself pacing, listening for the sound of the barn door, for his boots on the porch. When he finally came back inside, his face was grim. "What's wrong?" Rhea asked, already moving toward the stove to pour him coffee. "Lost one of the chickens. Fox got in somehow." He stripped off his gloves, fingers red from cold. "Fixed the gap, but the damage is done. Just one?" "Just one." He took the coffee gratefully, wrapping both hands around the cup. Could have been worse. A lot worse. Rhea knew what he wasn't saying. Out here, losing livestock wasn't just an inconvenience. It was lost food, lost trade goods, lost security. Every animal mattered. "I'll make chicken soup," she said. "Won't let it go to waste." Gideon nodded, then looked at her with something like approval. "You don't panic easy, do you?" "Learn not to. Panic doesn't fix things." "No, it doesn't." They worked together that afternoon, Rhea plucking and cleaning the bird while Gideon reinforced the chicken coop's defenses. By evening, the cabin smelled like herbs and simmering broth, and the immediate crisis had passed into just another challenge managed, another problem solved. But that night, lying in the loft while wind howled outside, Rhea found herself thinking about the gap in her old cabin's wall, the one she'd tried and failed to patch, the 100 small failures that had added up to slow death. Here, things got fixed. Here, when something broke, there were 2 sets of hands to repair it, 2 minds to solve the problem, 2 people carrying the weight instead of one. She was starting to understand what Gideon had meant about dying inside, about forgetting how to be human, because she'd been doing the same thing, just in a different way, isolating herself, shrinking her world down until survival was the only thing that mattered, until she'd forgotten there could be anything else. The wind rattled the shutters. Downstairs, she heard Gideon banking the fire for the night, his movements careful and practiced. He'd been taking care of this place alone for a decade, taking care of himself. And now, whether he'd admit it or not, taking care of her too. She wasn't sure when she'd started thinking of them as a unit, when his place had become their place in her mind. But somewhere in the rhythm of shared work and shared meals and shared silence, the shift had happened. It should have scared her. Instead, it felt like finally exhaling after holding her breath for too long. The snow kept falling. November bled into December. And slowly, carefully, something between them began to change. It started with small things. Gideon stopped sleeping by the fire and started sleeping in the small room off the main cabin that he'd been using for storage. He cleared it out without fanfare, set up a bedroll, and just moved, giving her privacy, giving them both space to be separate people under the same roof. Rhea started mending his clothes without being asked. She'd noticed the tears in his work shirt, the frayed cuffs on his coat, and one evening she just pulled them aside and started stitching. When he saw what she was doing, he didn't thank her or make a fuss, just nodded and went back to sharpening his knife. They developed routines that weren't about survival, but about comfort. Morning coffee together before the day started, evening conversations while they ate dinner, small exchanges
This story
that
was
said,
posted on the
"I see
channel
you,
The
I'm
Rusty
here,
Saddle.
we're doing
Please
this
do not
together."
repost it in any
And then
form.
there were the moments that crept up on her. Like when Gideon came in from chopping wood, his face red from exertion and cold, and Rhea found herself staring at the way his shoulders moved under his shirt. Or when she was cooking and he passed behind her, close enough that she could smell pine and wood smoke and something earthier, and her breath caught for just a second. She told herself it didn't mean anything, that it was just proximity and loneliness playing tricks on her, that she was reading into things that weren't there. But then came the day the well pump froze. It was mid-December, and the temperature had dropped so low that even the animals seemed stunned by it. Rhea had gone out to fetch water and found the pump handle locked solid, ice clogging the mechanism despite their best efforts to insulate it. "Gideon!" She called toward the barn, frustration sharp in her voice. He came quickly, took one look and swore under his breath. "Should have wrapped it better. Can we fix it?" "Have to. Can't haul water from the creek in this." He knelt down, examining the pump with the focused intensity he brought to every problem. "Need to heat it up, carefully. If we crack the metal, we're screwed until spring." They worked on it for hours. Gideon heated rocks by the fire, and Rhea wrapped them in cloth, pressing them against the frozen pump while he worked on loosening the ice inside. It was slow, miserable work, their fingers going numb despite gloves, their breath freezing in the air. At one point, Rhea slipped on a patch of ice, and Gideon caught her, one arm around her waist, steadying her against his chest. For a moment they stayed like that, close enough that she could feel his heart beating through layers of wool and canvas. "Careful," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, careful." He let her go slowly, and they went back to work. But something had shifted. Some line had been acknowledged, even if not crossed. When the pump finally gave, releasing a gush of blessedly unfrozen water, they both stood there breathing hard, exhausted, and triumphant. "We did it," Rhea said, almost laughing with relief. "We did." Gideon looked at her then, really looked at her, and there was something in his expression that made her stomach flip. Want, maybe. Or recognition. Or both. Then he turned away, gathering up the tools. "Come on. Let's get inside before we freeze to death out here." That night, Rhea couldn't sleep. She kept replaying that moment, his arm around her, the heat of him even through winter clothes, the way he'd looked at her like she was something worth seeing. She told herself this marriage was practical, convenient, a business arrangement between two people who needed what the other could provide. But business arrangements didn't make your pulse race, didn't make you hyper-aware of every movement, every word, every glance, didn't make you wonder what it would be like to climb down from the loft and knock on his door and stop pretending you didn't feel what you felt. Rhea rolled over, pulling the blankets tight around her shoulders. This was dangerous territory. She'd married Gideon to survive, not to fall in love. Love was complicated. Love was risk. Love was everything she'd lost once before and couldn't afford to lose again. But her heart, apparently, didn't care much about logic. Downstairs, she heard Gideon moving in his room, heard the creak of his bed frame, the rustle of blankets. Was he lying awake too? Was he fighting the same battle? Or was she reading everything wrong, projecting feelings that only went one direction? She didn't know. And not knowing was its own kind of torture. The days grew shorter, the snow piled higher, and the space between them filled with all the things they weren't saying. Christmas came and went with little ceremony. They weren't religious people, and out here there was no church, no community gathering, no reason to mark the day beyond acknowledging it existed. But on Christmas Eve, Rhea came down from the loft to find Gideon had set aside 2 pieces of dried apple pie, a luxury made from their carefully rationed supplies. "What's this?" she asked. "Figured we could use something sweet." He looked almost embarrassed. "It's not much. It's perfect." They ate the pie slowly, making it last, and afterward Gideon pulled out a bottle of whiskey from somewhere in the back of his cupboard. "Haven't opened this in years," he said, pouring them each a measure. "Seemed like the right time." The whiskey burned going down, warming her from the inside out. Ria wasn't much of a drinker, but tonight it felt right. Felt like marking something, even if she couldn't name what. "Tell me about your first winter up here," she said, settling into her chair by the fire. Gideon leaned back, the whiskey glass balanced on his knee. "Nearly killed me. Thought I was prepared, but the mountain doesn't care what you think. Ran out of food by February. Had to hunt in weather that would have frozen a lesser man solid." He paused, staring into the fire. "There were days I thought about just not getting up, not fighting anymore. Would have been easier." "What stopped you?" "Stubborn, I guess, and angry. Felt like if I died up here, it meant the mountain won. Couldn't let that happen." Ria understood that. Understood the anger that kept you alive when everything else wanted you dead. "What about you?" Gideon asked. "What was the worst moment after Thomas died?" She didn't want to answer, didn't want to go back to those dark months. But the whiskey had loosened something in her, and the firelight made confession easier. "There was a night in March. I was so cold I couldn't feel my feet. The food was almost gone. The cabin was falling apart around me, and I didn't have the strength to fix it." She paused, remembering. "I had Thomas's pistol. I took it out, loaded it, sat there for hours just holding it, thinking how easy it would be. How fast." Gideon's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on his glass. "What stopped you?" he asked quietly. "Don't know. Marnie. Maybe she showed up the next morning with supplies and I had to hide the gun before she saw. After that, the moment passed. The anger came back, the stubbornness." Ria looked at him. "Guess we're both too mean to die easy." "Guess so." They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, snow fell softly, adding to the drifts that already buried the world. But inside, there was warmth, there was safety. There was something Ria was almost afraid to name. "I'm glad you said yes," Gideon said suddenly. "To marrying me. I know it was crazy. Know I had no right to ask. But I'm glad you took the chance." "Me too," Ria said, and meant it. Their eyes met across the firelight, and this time neither of them looked away. The moment stretched, fragile and electric. Ria's heart hammered against her ribs. All she'd have to do was stand up, cross the few feet between them, and Gideon cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "It's late. We should get some rest." The moment shattered like dropped glass. "Right. Yeah." Ria stood too, suddenly aware of how much she'd wanted him to close that distance, how much she'd wanted him to stop being careful and just, "Good night, Ria. Good night." She climbed to the loft, her whole body humming with frustrated want. Lay there in the dark, listening to him move around below, putting away the bottle, banking the fire, settling in for the night. This couldn't keep going. This careful dance around what they both felt. Something would have to break eventually. She just didn't know if that breaking would destroy them or set them free. January brought a cold snap that made December look mild. For 2 weeks straight, the temperature barely climbed above zero during the day and plunged far below it at night. They burned through firewood at an alarming rate, and even with the stove going constantly, frost crept in along the window edges. They spent most of their time inside, huddled near the fire, finding ways to stay busy. Ria worked through the pile of mending she'd been putting off. Gideon carved new handles for tools that would need replacing come spring. They rationed their lamp oil and went to bed early to save fuel, lying in the dark, listening to the wind scream outside. It was during one of those long, dark evenings that Gideon started talking about his past. Real talk, not just survival stories or practical anecdotes. "I had a wife once," he said, his voice carrying up from below. "Long time ago, before I came to the mountains." Ria had been half asleep, but that jolted her awake. "What happened?" "She left. Can't blame her. I was young and stupid and thought I could make a living running a freight business back in Colorado. Lost everything in a bad winter. Horses, wagons, contracts. We were living in a boarding house, barely scraping by, and she just couldn't take it anymore. Went back to her family and filed for divorce. I'm sorry. Don't be. She was right to leave. I wasn't the man she married. Wasn't the man I thought I was, either." He paused. "That's when I came up here. Figured if I was going to fail, might as well do it somewhere no one could watch. But you didn't fail. No. Turns out I'm better at living alone than living with people. Or I was, anyway.
This story was posted on the
There
channel
was a
The Rusty
question in those
Saddle.
last
Please
words,
do not
a
repost it in
vulnerability
any
he
form.
didn't usually show. Rhea climbed down from the loft, unable to have this conversation through the floorboards. Gideon looked up in surprise as she came to sit in the chair across from him. "You're not failing now," she said. "How do you figure? You built this place. You survived. You made something that works." She met his eyes. "And you're not alone anymore. That takes a different kind of courage. Or desperation. Maybe both." Gideon studied her for a long moment. "What about you? What was Thomas like?" Rhea had known the question was coming eventually, had been dreading it and needing to answer it in equal measure. He was a dreamer. Always had these grand plans about what we'd build, what we'd become. The homestead was supposed to be the start of something bigger, a ranch, eventually, with hired hands and cattle and everything. She smiled sadly. He could sell you on anything when he got going, made you believe it was all possible. But it wasn't? No. He was good at dreaming, bad at executing. I'd try to slow him down, make him think practically, but he hated that. Called me his anchor. The word still stung even now. Meant it as a compliment, I think, but it felt like criticism, like I was holding him back from his potential. That's not fair. Maybe not, but he wasn't wrong either. I am practical. I do think about worst-case scenarios. I do worry about things going wrong. She looked at Gideon. That drove him crazy. We fought about it constantly, especially that last year. He wanted to expand when we couldn't afford it. I wanted to shore up what we had. We were barely speaking to each other when he died. The admission hurt. She'd never told anyone that before, never admitted that her marriage hadn't been the tragic love story people assumed. "I was angry at him for dying," she continued. "Angry that he left me alone with all his debts and half-finished projects and dreams that would never happen. Angry that I never got to tell him I was right to be worried. Angry that our last conversation was a fight about whether we could afford new livestock." Her voice cracked. "And then I felt guilty for being angry, because you're not supposed to hate someone who's dead. You're supposed to only remember the good parts." "That's bullshit," Gideon said bluntly. "Dead people aren't saints just because they're dead. They're still who they were, good and bad mixed together." "Yeah, they are." "Did you love him?" The question hung in the air between them, enormous and impossible. "I thought I did," Rhea said slowly. "When we got married, when we first came out here. But by the end," she trailed off, searching for honesty. "I don't know. Maybe love isn't enough when you want completely different things, when you can't see the world the same way." Gideon nodded slowly. "My wife used to say I loved the idea of things more than the actual things. The idea of success, the idea of being a businessman. But when it came down to the daily work, the unglamorous parts, I couldn't stick with it. Is that true?" "Probably. I'm better with the unglamorous parts now, better at sticking." He looked at her steadily. "I meant what I said when I asked you to marry me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not quitting on this." "Even though it's not what you imagined?" "Nothing ever is. But that doesn't make it wrong." They sat in silence for a while, the fire burning low between them. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. "Can I ask you something?" Rhea said finally. "Go ahead." "That first day when you came to my place, why me specifically? There are other widows in the settlements, younger ones, prettier ones, women who'd probably jump at the chance to marry a man with a solid homestead." Gideon was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I saw you trying to split wood with a broken axe, and you didn't quit. You just kept swinging, even though it was useless, even though you were exhausted. That kind of stubbornness." He shook his head. "That's what survives out here. Not pretty, not young, just stubborn enough to keep going when any sane person would stop. That's it? My stubbornness? No." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. "I saw myself in you. Saw someone who'd been alone so long they forgot how to ask for help. Saw someone drowning and too proud to scream. I figured if we were both drowning, maybe we could keep each other afloat. Ria's chest tightened. And are we? Keeping each other afloat? Yeah, I think we are. The admission settled between them, honest and unadorned. They weren't drowning anymore. They were treading water together, maybe even swimming toward something that looked like shore. Ria stood, suddenly unable to sit still. I should get back to bed. Ria. She turned back. Gideon had stood too, and the firelight cast shadows across his face, making him look younger and older at the same time. I'm glad you're here, he said simply. Me too. She climbed back to the loft, but this time the conversation didn't feel unfinished, didn't feel like they were talking around something instead of about it. They were figuring it out, slowly, carefully, honestly. And that, Ria thought as she pulled the blankets up, was more than she'd had in any relationship before, more than pretty words or grand promises. Just two people trying to see each other clearly and not flinch away from what they found. The cold snap broke in mid-January, and they ventured outside more. Gideon taught Ria how to snowshoe, and they ranged farther from the cabin, checking trap lines he'd set earlier in the season. She learned to read animal tracks in the snow, to move quietly through the forest, to think like prey and predator both. She was good at it, better than she expected, and Gideon seemed genuinely pleased when she spotted things he'd missed. A rabbit warren hidden under a fallen log, a fox den tucked into a rocky outcropping. You've got the eyes for this, he said, examining the fox tracks she'd found. Most people from the settlements can't see past their own feet. You actually look. Thomas used to say I was paranoid, always watching for things to go wrong. That's not paranoid, that's smart. Gideon straightened up, shouldering his pack. The mountain rewards people who pay attention, punishes everyone else. They kept walking, their snowshoes crunching through the crust of old snow. The sky was a pale winter blue, the sun bright but cold, beautiful in a way that would kill you if you let your guard down. Can I ask you something? Ria said. You've been asking me things all month. Why stop now? She smiled at that. Fair. I was wondering, when you first asked me to marry you, did you expect it to work? Actually work? Honestly, didn't know. Figured we'd either figure it out or make each other miserable and call it off after a year like I promised. And now? He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Now I'm hoping you'll want to stay past the year. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. You are? Yeah, I know we haven't talked about it. No, you might still want out when spring comes, but he ran a hand over his beard, looking uncomfortable in a way she'd rarely seen. I'd like you to stay, if you want to. It wasn't a grand declaration. Wasn't romantic or poetic, just honest want, offered plainly. I'll think about it, Ria said, though her heart had already made the decision months ago. Fair enough. They walked back to the cabin in companionable silence, and that night Ria lay awake thinking about the future, about what it would mean to stay not because she had to, but because she wanted to, about choosing Gideon not out of desperation, but out of something far more dangerous. February arrived with more snow and shorter tempers. They'd been cooped up together for months now, and the strain was starting to show. Small things became big things, the way he chewed his food, the way she organized the kitchen, the way they both wanted the space closest to the fire. They had their first real fight on a gray afternoon when cabin fever had them both on edge. It started over something stupid. Ria had reorganized the tool storage, and Gideon couldn't find his favorite chisel. He'd snapped at her, she'd snapped back. And suddenly they were yelling about everything and nothing, all the frustration of the long winter pouring out at once. You can't just move things without telling me, Gideon shouted. I'm trying to make this place more efficient. Everything was just thrown wherever. It worked fine before you got here. Oh, so now I'm the problem. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. They stood on opposite sides of the cabin, both breathing hard, both furious. Then Ria grabbed her coat and stormed outside, needing space, needing air, needing anything but four walls in his anger. She made it halfway to the barn before she realized how stupid this was. It was below zero. She wasn't dressed properly, and she was angry at herself as much as him. Gideon came out a few minutes later, properly bundled up, carrying her gloves. "You forgot these," he said stiffly. "I don't need them. Your fingers will freeze off in 10 minutes. Take them." She snatched the gloves from him, shoved her hands into them. They stood there in the snow, not looking at each other. "I'm sorry," Gideon said finally. "You were right. The tools were a mess. I don't like change. I should have asked first." "No, you shouldn't have to ask permission to organize your own home." The words landed heavy. Your own home. Not his home she was living in, not a temporary arrangement. Home. "I'm not used to this," Rhea said quietly. "Living with someone. Sharing space. Thomas and I, we had our own territories, our own systems. We didn't really share things. We're not them. No, we're not."
This story was posted
She
on the
finally
channel
looked
The
at him.
Rusty Saddle.
But I
Please
don't
do
know how
not
to do this.
repost it in any
How to be
form.
married to someone I actually like. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. "You like me?" "Of course I like you. You're the most irritating, stubborn, impossible man I've ever met, and I like you anyway." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You're not so easy yourself." "I know." They stood there in the cold, and then Gideon stepped closer, close enough that she could see the ice crystals forming in his beard. "I like you too," he said. "Even when you reorganize my entire workshop without asking. I'll try to warn you next time. I'll try not to be such an ass about it." He reached out and tugged her coat tighter around her neck, his gloved fingers gentle. The gesture was so casual, so intimate, that Rhea felt something in her chest crack open. "Come on," Gideon said. "Let's get inside before we both freeze." That night they moved around each other differently, more carefully, more aware of the space between them and the thing growing in it. Rhea was starting to realize that what scared her wasn't the possibility that this wouldn't work. It was the possibility that it would, that she'd let herself fall completely and have everything to lose all over again. But maybe, she thought as she climbed into bed, maybe that was the only way to live. Not safe, not protected. Just open to whatever came, good or bad, and trusting you'd survive it. She was done surviving. She wanted to live, and that meant taking the biggest risk of all. The thaw came in early March, weeks earlier than Gideon expected. The snow began to soften and pull back from the edges of the cabin, revealing dead grass and muddy earth beneath. Water dripped from the eaves in a constant rhythm that sounded almost like music after months of silence. Rhea stood on the porch one morning, watching the transformation, and felt something shift inside her chest. They'd made it. They'd survived the winter that would have killed her alone. And more than that, they'd survived each other. "First thing we need to do is check the traps," Gideon said, coming to stand beside her. "See what the winter left us. And then? Then we start preparing for spring planting. Ground will be soft enough in a few weeks. We, us." The language had changed without her noticing. Somewhere between November and now, they'd stopped being two people sharing space and become something else entirely. "Gideon," she started, then stopped. She'd been working up to this conversation for weeks, but now that the moment was here, the words stuck in her throat. "What is it?" "I want to stay, past the year, if the offer still stands." He turned to look at her fully, his expression unreadable. "You sure?" "Yeah, I'm sure." Something in his face softened, not quite a smile, but close. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." "Just good?" "What do you want me to say? That I'm relieved? That I've been worried for weeks you'd leave come spring?" He shook his head. "Yeah, Rhea, I'm glad you're staying." She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him about the feeling in her chest when she watched him work, or the way her heart jumped when he smiled, or how she'd stopped being able to imagine a future that didn't include him. But the words felt too big, too dangerous, so instead she just nodded and went inside to start breakfast. They fell into the rhythm of early spring, checking the property for winter damage, repairing fences, planting the garden. The work was constant but different from winter's desperate survival. This was building towards something, creating instead of just enduring. One afternoon, Gideon came back from checking the upper pasture with a strange look on his face. What's wrong? Rhea asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Had a visitor while I was up there. Marnie Tate said she was looking for you. Rhea's stomach dropped. She hadn't seen Marnie since the wedding, hadn't even thought to send word that she was all right. What did she want? To make sure you weren't dead or being held against your will, from the sound of it. Gideon's mouth twitched. Gave me a hell of an interrogation. Wanted to know if you were eating enough, if I was treating you right, if you had any bruises she should know about. What did you tell her? Told her to ask you herself. She's waiting down by the barn. Rhea found Marnie exactly where Gideon said, looking around the homestead with sharp, assessing eyes. When she saw Rhea, her expression shifted from suspicious to something softer. You look different, Marnie said without preamble. Different how? Healthier, less like you're about to break. She studied Rhea's face. So, he treating you right? Yeah, he is. You sure? Because if you're just saying that, Marnie, Rhea cut her off gently. I'm sure. He's good. Better than I expected. Marnie's eyes narrowed. You in love with him yet? The question was so blunt it knocked the air from Rhea's lungs. What? You heard me. That look on your face when you talk about him. I've seen it before. Usually ends one of two ways. Rhea felt heat rising in her cheeks. We're not. Right. Marnie's expression softened. Look, I came up here ready to drag you back to civilization if needed, but I can see you're doing fine. Better than fine, so I'll leave you to it. She started toward her horse, then paused. One thing, though, don't wait too long to tell him how you feel. Life's too short and winters are too long up here. You wait around for the perfect moment, you might not get another one. She rode off before Rhea could respond, leaving her standing in the muddy yard with her heart racing and Marnie's words echoing in her head. That night, Rhea couldn't settle. She tried to focus on mending, but her hands were restless. Tried to read, but the words blurred together. Finally, she gave up and went to stand by the window, staring out at the darkness. You all right? Gideon's voice came from behind her. Marnie said something today. Got me thinking. About what? Rhea turned to face him. In the lamplight, he looked tired but content, his sleeves rolled up from washing dishes, his hair damp from where he'd splashed water on his face. Familiar, safe, and somehow, without her noticing when it happened, absolutely essential. About what comes next, she said carefully. Next how? For us. What we are. What we're becoming. Gideon set down the dish towel he'd been holding. And what are we becoming? I don't know. That's what scares me. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet away. Close, but not crowding. Does it have to be scary? Yes, because the last time I let myself care about someone, I lost him. And even before I lost him, we were falling apart. She struggled for words. I don't know how to do this right, how to be with someone without it all going wrong. Neither do I, Gideon said quietly. My marriage fell apart because I couldn't be what she needed, couldn't even be what I needed. But this, he gestured between them. This feels different. We didn't start with romance or promises we couldn't keep. We started with honesty, with reality. And that's enough? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. He took a breath. But I know I want to try. I know that when you said you were staying, I felt something I haven't felt in years. Relief, hope. Something that felt like the future stopped being just another day to survive and started being something worth building toward. Rhea's throat tightened. Gideon, you don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for declarations or promises. I'm just telling you where I stand. He met her eyes steadily. I care about you, Rhea, more than I plan to, more than I probably should. And if you need time to figure out how you feel about that, I can wait. The space between them felt electric, charged with everything they'd been dancing around for months. Rhea could cross it, could close the distance and see what happened. Or she could retreat back to safety, to the careful boundaries they'd maintained. She thought about Marnie's words, about perfect moments and waiting too long. She stepped forward, Gideon's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't move, just watched her come closer until they were barely a foot apart. "I'm scared," Rhea said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know. I'm scared of getting this wrong, of losing you, of—" He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one calloused hand. "I'm scared too." "Yeah?"
This story was posted
Terrifying.
on the channel The Rusty Saddle.
And then finally,
Please do not
he kissed
repost
her.
it in any form.
It wasn't dramatic or passionate. It was careful and questioning, a conversation without words. Rhea felt something in her chest crack open completely, and she kissed him back with all the want she'd been holding in for months. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Gideon rested his forehead against hers. "Still scared?" he asked. "Yeah, but I don't care anymore." He laughed, the sound rough and surprised. "Good, because I'm not letting you back out now. Wouldn't dream of it." They stood there for a long moment, just breathing together, before Rhea took his hand and led him toward his room. They'd spent months being careful, being proper, maintaining the fiction that this was just a practical arrangement, but practical had turned into something real, and Rhea was done pretending otherwise. Morning came soft and golden, light filtering through the curtains of Gideon's room. Rhea woke slowly, warm and tangled in blankets and the solid presence of the man beside her. For a moment she just lay there, listening to him breathe, trying to process the fact that this was real, that she'd allowed herself to fall and the world hadn't ended. "You thinking loud over there?" Gideon's voice was rough with sleep. "Maybe." "Want to share?" Rhea rolled over to face him. His hair was a mess, his beard flattened on one side, and there was a crease on his cheek from the pillow. He looked human and imperfect and absolutely right. "I was thinking this is going to change things," she said. "Probably. And that scares me." "I know." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But we'll figure it out, same way we figured out everything else. Together? Together." They spent the morning in a kind of quiet domesticity that felt new and familiar at the same time. Rhea made coffee while Gideon started the fire. They ate breakfast sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. Small things. Simple things. But weighted with meaning now. Later, as they worked on reinforcing the chicken coop, the fox from winter had given them both a healthy paranoia, Gideon cleared his throat. "I was thinking," he started, "dangerous activity." He shot her a look that was pure amusement. "I was thinking we should probably talk about expectations, about what this means going forward." "You mean besides the obvious?" "Yeah, I mean..." He hammered in a nail with more force than necessary. "I'm not Thomas. I'm not going to make you grand promises about building an empire or becoming something we're not. This is what I've got. A homestead, a simple life, not much else." "I know that. And you're okay with it?" Rhea set down her own hammer and looked at him directly. "Gideon, I watched Thomas dream himself to death trying to be something bigger than he was. I don't want grand promises. I want what you've already given me, honesty, partnership, and someone who sees reality the same way I do. Even if reality is sometimes just mud and chickens and hard work, especially then." He smiled, and something in his expression eased. They went back to work, but the tension that had been there, the question of whether this could really work, had loosened its grip. The next few weeks passed in a kind of golden haze. The weather continued to warm, the land coming back to life in shades of green and brown. They planted the garden together, Gideon showing Rhea the best spots for different crops, Rhea suggesting organization systems that made him shake his head but implement anyway. They fell into new rhythms. Mornings started in his bed, tangled together before the demands of the day pulled them apart. Evenings ended the same way, talking in the dark about everything and nothing until sleep claimed them both. It wasn't perfect. They still fought occasionally, both too stubborn to back down easily, but the fights felt different now, like they were arguing towards something instead of just fighting to win. One night in late March, as they lay in bed listening to rain drum against the roof, Rhea said something she'd been thinking about for days. "I want to write to Marnie, tell her we're getting married for real." Gideon propped himself up on one elbow. "We are married for real." "You know what I mean. Married like we mean it, not just a practical arrangement. Think she doesn't already know? Probably, but I want to tell her anyway. Rhea turned to look at him. I want people to know that I chose this, that I chose you. Something fierce and tender crossed his face. Yeah, okay, we can do that. But before Rhea could write that letter, before spring could fully take hold, everything changed. It was a Thursday morning when the rider came. Rhea was in the garden, marking out rows for beans, when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up to see a man in a dark coat riding toward the cabin, official-looking and out of place in the wild country. Gideon emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. Can I help you? The man dismounted, pulling papers from his saddlebag. Looking for Rhea Calloway. Got legal documents that need delivering. Rhea's stomach clenched. Nothing good ever came from legal documents delivered to your door. I'm Rhea Calloway. Not anymore, you're not, Gideon said quietly. It's Rhea Hale now. The man consulted his papers. Says here, Rhea Calloway, widow of Thomas Calloway, late of the Northern Territory. What's this about? Rhea asked, walking closer. Debt collection, ma'am. Your late husband had outstanding loans totaling $4,000. The notes come due and the creditor is demanding payment. The world seemed to tilt sideways. 4,000? That's impossible. Thomas never mentioned. It's all here in writing, signed and witnessed. The man held out the papers. You've got 30 days to settle the debt, or the creditor takes possession of all assets, including land and property. Rhea snatched the papers, her hands shaking. The numbers swam before her eyes, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakably Thomas's, dated 2 months before he died. There has to be a mistake, she said, her voice sounding far away. No mistake, ma'am. The law's clear on this. Widows inherit debts along with assets. He climbed back on his horse. Like I said, 30 days. After that, collection proceedings begin. He rode off, leaving Rhea standing in the mud with papers she couldn't quite process clutched in her numb hands. Gideon took them from her gently, scanning the contents. His jaw tightened as he read. 4,000, he said flatly. What the hell was he thinking? I don't know. He never said anything about this kind of debt. Rhea felt sick. We couldn't even afford to fix the cabin roof and he borrowed $4,000? Says here it was for livestock, for expanding the operation. We didn't expand. We barely had enough to feed ourselves. Gideon kept reading, his expression growing darker. The creditor is listed as Silas Thorne. You know that name? No, never heard it. I have. Gideon's voice was grim. He's a land speculator, loans money to homesteaders at high interest, then waits for them to default so he can claim the land. He's bought up half the territory that way. Rhea felt cold despite the warm spring air. But Thomas died. The debt should have died with him. Not if he put up the land as collateral, which according to this, he did. Gideon looked at her, and she saw fear in his eyes for the first time since she'd known him. Rhea, this says the collateral is your old homestead and any property acquired through marriage. The words took a moment to sink in. When they did, Rhea felt like the ground had opened up beneath her feet. Our land, she whispered. He can take our land. If the debt's legitimate, yeah, he can take everything. They stood there in the spring sunshine, the garden half planted and the future suddenly collapsing around them. 4 months ago, Rhea had been alone and desperate, facing a winter that would kill her. Now she had everything, a home, a partner, a life worth living. And Thomas, even dead, might take it all away. We'll fight it, Gideon said, his voice hard. We'll find a lawyer, challenge the debt. With what money? You've seen our savings. We've got maybe $300 put aside. Not enough to pay the debt, not enough to hire anyone good enough to fight this. Then we'll sell livestock, sell furs, sell whatever we have to. It won't be enough, not in 30 days. Rhea's mind was racing, calculating, trying to find a way out of the trap Thomas had left her in. Even if we sold everything, we'd come up short. Gideon grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. We are not losing this place. I don't care what I have to do. I'll work every mine in the territory. I'll hire myself out as a guide. I'll rob a bank if I have to. But we are not losing our home. Gideon, no, I spent 10 years building this place, 10 years alone in these mountains making something that would last. And then you came and it finally meant something beyond just surviving. I am not letting some vulture take that away." The intensity in his voice, in his eyes, should have been frightening. Instead, it steadied something in Rhea. They were in this together. Whatever came, they'd face it the same way they'd faced everything else. "Okay," she said. "Okay, we fight."
This
That night,
story
they
was
sat at the
posted on the
table,
channel
legal
The
papers
Rusty
spread out
Saddle.
between them,
Please do not
trying to find
repost it
any
in any
loophole or
form.
weakness. But the contract was ironclad. Thomas's signature, 2 witnesses, everything legal and binding. "I don't understand, Finn," Rhea said for the 10th time. "Why would he do this? We were barely scraping by. Why take on more debt? Probably thought he could make it work. Thought he'd buy livestock, build up the herd, pay it back with profit to spare. But he didn't buy livestock. We had the same 3 chickens and 1 horse the whole time." Gideon frowned, reading through the papers again. "The loan was dispersed in November, 2 years ago. You remember anything different about that time?" Rhea tried to think back. November, 2 years ago, before things got really bad, before the worst of the fighting. He went to town for a week, said he was meeting with potential buyers for our spring lambs, but we didn't have any lambs. I thought it was strange, but he got angry when I questioned him, so I let it drop. $4,000, Gideon said slowly. "That's not pocket change. If he didn't spend it on livestock, where did it go?" "I don't know." But even as she said it, Rhea felt a cold suspicion forming. Thomas had been a dreamer, yes, but he'd also been a gambler, not just with money, but with their future, their stability. And if he'd gone to town for a week with $4,000 and come back with nothing to show for it. "You think he gambled it away?" Gideon said, reading her expression. "I don't know, maybe. Or maybe he invested it in something that fell through. Or maybe—" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter what he did with it. It's gone and we're stuck with the debt." Gideon stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "There has to be something we're missing, some way to challenge this. Even if we could prove Thomas misused the funds, the debt is still valid. We'd still owe the money. Then we borrow against my land, use it as collateral to pay off Thomas's debt." "No," Rhea's voice was sharp. "I won't let you risk what you built because of my husband's mistakes. Our husband's mistakes. We're married, remember? Your problems are my problems. Not like this. Not when it could cost you everything." They stared at each other across the cabin, both stubborn, both scared, neither willing to back down. Finally, Gideon came back to the table, sitting down heavily. "So what do we do?" "I go to town. Talk to this Silas Thorne. See if he'll negotiate a payment plan or settle for less. Men like Thorne don't negotiate. They squeeze until there's nothing left. Then I'll make him see reason. Rhea, I have to try. What else can we do? Just wait out the 30 days and hope for a miracle?" Gideon's jaw worked, but he didn't argue. They both knew she was right. Doing nothing wasn't an option. "Fine, but I'm coming with you. You should stay here. Someone needs to watch the homestead." "I'm coming with you," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We're in this together. That means all of it." Rhea wanted to argue, wanted to protect him from the mess Thomas had created, but looking at his face, stubborn and determined and absolutely committed, she knew she'd never win that fight. "Okay," she said quietly. "Together." They left at dawn 2 days later, taking only what they'd need for the journey to the settlement. The ride down from the mountains felt different than it had last fall when Rhea had made the trip alone, desperate and afraid. Now she had Gideon beside her, solid and steady, and the fear was different. Not the fear of dying alone, but the fear of losing everything they'd built together. The settlement looked the same as always. Rough buildings clustered around a muddy main street, people going about their business with the determined efficiency of frontier life. But now Rhea saw it differently. Saw the land office where Thomas must have signed those papers. Saw the saloon where he might have gambled away their future. Saw the past reaching up to drag her back down. They found Silas Thorne in a small office above the general store. He was a thin man with calculating eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "Mrs. Calloway," he said when they entered. "I was wondering when you'd come calling." "It's Mrs. Hale now," Rhea said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ah, yes. Congratulations on your remarriage, though I'm afraid it doesn't change the legal situation." "We're here to discuss the debt," Gideon said. Thorne leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "What's to discuss? The terms are clear, $4,000 in 30 days or I take possession of the property." "The original loan was for my wife's previous homestead," Gideon said. "You have no claim on my land." "Actually, I do. Your marriage merged the properties legally. The debt transfers with it." Thorne pulled out a copy of the contract. "It's all here in black and white." Rhea felt sick. "There has to be some way to settle this, a payment plan, something. I suppose I could accept partial payment. Say $3,000 up front and the rest over time. With interest, of course." "We don't have $3,000, Rhea said. "Then I suppose we're done here, unless—" Thorne's eyes glittered. "I might be willing to settle for the land itself. Your old homestead plus, say, the southern quarter of Mr. Hale's property. The part with the creek and the good timber." "Go to hell, Dean," Gideon said flatly. Now, no need for hostility. I'm just a businessman collecting what's owed." "You're a vulture, Ishin," Rhea said, anger finally breaking through her fear. "You loan desperate people money they can't pay back and then steal their land when they default. I prefer to think of it as providing opportunity. Your late husband had opportunities. What he did with them isn't my concern." Thorne stood, clearly done with the conversation. "You have 28 days remaining. After that, the property transfers to me, unless, of course, you manage to come up with the full amount." They left the office in silence, both too angry and scared to speak. Outside, the settlement went on about its business, oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding. "We need a lawyer," Gideon said finally. "Someone who can look at this contract and find a way out." "With what money?" "I don't care. We'll figure it out." They found a lawyer in a cramped office at the edge of town. Harold Chen was young, but came recommended by the clerk at the land office. He listened to their story, reviewed the papers, and his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is bad," he said finally. "Can you help us?" Rhea asked. "Maybe, but it'll take time and money. I'd need to research precedents, file motions, possibly take it to the territorial court." He named a figure that made Rhea's stomach drop. More than they had, more than they could get. "And even then," Chen continued, "the law is pretty clear. Debts transfer with property. Unless you can prove fraud or coercion, the contract stands." "What about investigating where the money went?" Gideon asked. "If Thomas didn't use it for the stated purpose, that might give us an argument, but it's a long shot, and it would require proof, records, witnesses, evidence that doesn't exist anymore." They left the lawyer's office with less hope than they'd entered with. The sun was setting, painting the settlement in shades of orange and red, beautiful and indifferent. "We're going to lose everything, aren't we?" Rhea said quietly. Gideon didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was rough. "No, there has to be another way." But as they rode back toward the mountains in the gathering dark, Rhea couldn't see what that way might be. Thomas had left her a debt she couldn't pay, and a future that was crumbling before it had even really begun. And the worst part was knowing that just when she'd finally found something worth keeping, it might all be taken away. They rode through the night, pushing the horses harder than they should have, both too wound up to stop. When they finally reached the homestead just before dawn, exhausted and hollow, Gideon went straight to the barn without a word. Rhea stood in the yard, watching the first light creep over the mountains, and felt the weight of it all pressing down until she could barely breathe. She found him an hour later, sitting on a hay bale with his head in his hands. "I'm selling everything," he said without looking up. "The livestock, the furs, the tools I don't absolutely need. I'll work every job I can find between now and the deadline. Logging, hauling freight, whatever pays." "Gideon, it won't be enough, I know that. But maybe it'll be close enough to negotiate with." Rhea sat down beside him, the hay scratching through her skirt. "You'd give up everything you've built." "What's the alternative? Let them take it anyway?" "We could leave, take what we can carry, and go somewhere Thorne can't find us." He finally looked at her, and his expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. Run? That's your solution? It's not running, it's surviving. It's the same damn thing, and I'm done running from my problems, done letting other people take what's mine. He stood abruptly. This is our home, Rhea, yours and mine. I'm not giving it up without a fight. Even if the fight destroys you, even then. They stared at each other, and Rhea saw the stubborn pride that had kept him alive alone in the mountains for 10 years. The same pride that wouldn't let him back down now.
This story was
even when
posted on the
backing
channel
down
The
might be
Rusty
smarter.
Saddle. Please do not
Okay,
repost it in any
she said
form.
quietly. Then we fight. The next 2 weeks were a blur of desperate activity. Gideon sold off half the livestock at prices that made Rhea wince. He took jobs hauling timber down the mountain, working 18-hour days until he came home so exhausted he could barely stand. Rhea went through everything they owned, selling what they could spare, and some things they couldn't. She sold her mother's locket, the one piece of her old life she'd kept, the one thing of value she owned. Got $50 for it from a jeweler in town who probably turned around and sold it for 3 times that. The money went into their growing pile of cash that still wasn't nearly enough. Marnie came by one afternoon and found Rhea in the garden, pulling weeds with mechanical efficiency. Heard what happened, Marnie said without preamble. Whole settlements talking about it. I'm sure they are. Most folks think Thorne's a snake. Some are saying they'll help if they can. Rhea laughed bitterly. Help how? Nobody up here has that kind of money. No, but they've got time. Labor. Some of them are talking about pooling resources. Marnie, I appreciate it, but we need $4,000 in 2 weeks. Even if everyone in the territory chipped in, we wouldn't get close. Marnie was quiet for a moment. You thought about challenging the debt itself? Maybe Thomas never actually received the money. Maybe Thorne's records are fraudulent. The contract's legitimate. The lawyer looked at it. Thomas signed it. 2 witnesses confirmed it. The money was transferred. Where'd it go? I don't know. Thomas went to town for a week that November. Came back broke. I think he gambled it away or invested it in something that failed. Or someone stole it from him. Rhea looked up sharply. What? Think about it. $4,000 is a fortune up here. If word got out Thomas was carrying that kind of cash, someone might have taken it. Might have killed him for it even. Thomas died in a snowstorm. They found his body 3 miles from the cabin. There was an investigation. Was there? Or did the territorial marshal just assume exposure and close the case? Rhea sat back on her heels, her mind racing. Thomas had died in February, 2 months after that mysterious trip to town. The official story was that he'd gone out to check the trap lines and got caught in a sudden storm. His body was found frozen, no signs of violence, just a man who'd made a fatal mistake. But what if there was more to it? Even if you're right, Rhea said slowly, how does that help us? Thomas is still dead and the debt is still real. I don't know, but maybe it's worth looking into. Maybe there's something there that could help your case. After Marnie left, Rhea couldn't shake the thought. She went through Thomas's things, what little remained after she'd sold most of it, found his journal tucked in the back of a drawer. She'd never read it before. Felt like an invasion of privacy even after his death. But privacy didn't matter anymore. The entries were sporadic and mostly mundane. Notes about weather, livestock, things that needed repairing. But then she found the November entries, right around when he would have gotten the loan. Met with ST today. Deal is set. $4,000 for 6 months at 15%. Told R I was meeting buyers. Couldn't tell her the truth. She'd try to talk me out of it. But this is going to work. It has to. St. Silas Thorne. So Thomas had met with him directly. The next entry was 3 days later. Lost half of it at Fletcher's. Stupid. So stupid. But I can make it back. Just need one good hand. Rhea's stomach dropped. Fletcher's was a gambling house in the settlement, known for high-stakes poker and men who walked in wealthy and out broke. The entries after that were increasingly desperate. Down to 800. How did this happen? Need to figure out a way to fix this before R finds out. Borrowed 200 from JM to buy time, told Thorne I needed an extension. He laughed at me. The last entry was dated a week before Thomas died. Thorne knows I can't pay, said he'll take the land instead. I've destroyed everything. R is going to hate me when she finds out. Maybe it's better if I don't make it through the winter. Rhea read that last line 3 times, each time feeling sicker. Had Thomas gone out into that storm on purpose? Had he chosen to die rather than face what he'd done? She'd never know. But what she did know was that Thomas had gambled away their future with full knowledge of the consequences, had lied to her, kept secrets, and left her to deal with the wreckage. When Gideon came home that night, filthy from a day hauling logs, Rhea showed him the journal. He read it in silence, his jaw getting tighter with each page. When he finished, he set it down carefully, like it might explode. So he knew, Gideon said flatly. Knew he'd ruined you and did it anyway. Yeah. And Thorne knew from the start that Thomas couldn't pay. Set him up to fail so he could take the land. Looks that way? Gideon stood and paced, that caged animal energy back in full force. This changes things. How? We still owe the money. But if we can prove Thorne set up the loan knowing Thomas couldn't pay, knowing he'd default, that's fraud. Predatory lending. The contract might not hold up. Rhea wanted to hope. Wanted to believe they'd found a way out. But she'd learned not to trust hope too easily. We'd need proof, documentation, more than just Thomas's journal entries. Then we get proof. We go back to that lawyer, tell him what we found, see if there's a legal angle. We can't afford him, Gideon. I'll sell the horses if I have to. I'll sell everything. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands. Listen to me. This is our shot. Maybe our only shot. We have to take it. The intensity in his eyes, the desperate certainty, broke something in Rhea. Okay, we'll try. They rode back to the settlement the next morning, pushing hard to make it before the lawyer's office closed. Harold Chen looked surprised to see them again. I didn't expect you back so soon, he said. We found something, Rhea said, handing him Thomas's journal. Evidence that Silas Thorne set up this loan knowing my husband couldn't repay it. Chen read through the entries carefully, his expression thoughtful. When he finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. This is interesting, he said, but it's not proof of fraud. It's proof your husband made bad decisions. But Thorne had to know, Gideon insisted. A man asks for $4,000 with nothing to back it up except a failing homestead. Any legitimate lender would refuse. Thorne gave him the money knowing he'd default. Proving what Thorne knew and when he knew it is a lot harder than you think. We'd need his financial records, correspondence, testimony from witnesses. Chen paused. All of which would require a formal investigation, which requires filing a complaint with the territorial court, which requires money we don't have, Rhea finished. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear. They left the office defeated, stood on the street while people moved around them, going about normal lives while their world crumbled. There has to be another way, Gideon said, but his voice lacked conviction. Rhea was about to respond when she saw a familiar figure coming out of the general store. Clem, the owner of the trading post, the same man who'd told her about Gideon months ago. On impulse, she called out to him. Clem, can I talk to you for a minute? Clem ambled over, his weathered face creasing in a smile. Mrs. Hale, good to see you. Heard you've been having some trouble. That's putting it mildly. Can I ask you something about Silas Thorne? Clem's expression soured. What about him? How many people has he done this to? The predatory loans, taking land when they default? Too many to count. Been going on for years. Why? Because there has to be a pattern. Documentation. Something that proves he's doing this deliberately. Clem rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. There might be. A couple years back, a homesteader named Dutch Reinhardt tried to fight Thorne in court. Said the loan was fraudulent. Case got dismissed for lack of evidence, but Dutch did a lot of digging. Talked to everyone Thorne had loaned money to, tried to find a pattern. Where's Dutch now? Dead. Fell off his horse drunk about 6 months after losing his case, but his widow's still around, lives in a cabin about 10 miles south of here, named Sarah. Rhea looked at Gideon. He nodded. Thank you, Clem, she said. They found Sarah Reinhardt's cabin late that afternoon. It was a small, ramshackle place that reminded Rhea painfully of her old homestead. Sarah herself was a hard-faced woman in her 50s who answered the door with a shotgun in hand. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying," she said. "We're not selling anything. We need your help." Rhea explained quickly about the debt, about Thorne, about her husband's journal. Sarah's expression shifted from suspicious to bitter. "Thorne. That bastard took everything from us. My Dutch tried to fight him, and it killed him. Clem said Dutch did an investigation, that he talked to Thorne's other victims.
This story was
He
posted
did.
on the channel
Spent
The Rusty
months on it.
Saddle. Please do
Interviewed
not
20
repost
people,
it in any
documented
form.
30 different loans, found a pattern clear as day. Thorne targets desperate homesteaders, offers them money they can't refuse, sets terms they can't meet, then takes the land when they default. Do you still have Dutch's records? Maybe. Why? Because we're going to fight Thorne, and we need evidence." Sarah studied them for a long moment. Then she lowered the shotgun. "Come inside." The cabin's interior was cluttered but organized. Sarah led them to a trunk in the corner and pulled out a stack of papers bound with string. "This is everything Dutch collected. Names, dates, loan amounts, default dates, property transfers. Took him 6 months to put together." She handed the stack to Rhea. "Didn't save him in court. Judge said it wasn't enough to prove criminal intent." Rhea flipped through the pages. It was extensive. Meticulous documentation of Thorne's pattern of predatory lending. 15 homesteaders who'd lost their land. 20 more who were still fighting. "Why didn't this work in court, Gideon asked. "Because Thorne's got friends in high places. The territorial judge who heard Dutch's case? Turned out he'd taken a loan from Thorne himself years back. Conflict of interest, but nothing we could prove." Sarah's voice was bitter. "The system protects men like Thorne. Punishes people like us." Rhea felt the familiar weight of defeat settling in. Even with evidence, even with documentation, they were fighting a rigged game. But then something occurred to her. Something Sarah had said. "Wait, you said the judge had taken a loan from Thorne?" Years ago, yeah, before he was a judge. "Is there any record of that?" "Dutch found the contract in the county records." "Why?" Rhea's mind was racing. Because if a sitting judge ruled in favor of a creditor he had financial ties to, that's corruption. That's grounds for appealing the decision. Sarah's eyes widened. "Dutch's case. You want to reopen Dutch's case." "Not just reopen it. Use it to establish precedent. If we can prove the original ruling was corrupt, it invalidates every land transfer Thorne's made since then, including ours." Gideon was looking at her like he'd never seen her before. "That's brilliant." "That's a long shot," Sarah said, but there was hope in her voice now. "You'd need a new lawyer, one willing to go up against Thorne in the territorial court. We'll find one. And money. Appeals aren't cheap. We'll find that too." Rhea didn't know where the certainty was coming from. They had no money, no lawyer, no real plan. But for the first time since that writer had delivered the debt notice, she felt like they had a fighting chance. Sarah let them take Dutch's records. As they were leaving, she caught Rhea's arm. "My Dutch died believing he'd failed. Died thinking Thorne had won." Her grip was fierce. "You make this right. You take that bastard down. For Dutch. For everyone he's ruined." "We'll try," Rhea promised. They rode back toward their homestead as the sun set, Dutch's documentation packed carefully in Gideon's saddlebag. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in thought. Finally, as they stopped to rest the horses, Gideon said, "You know this is crazy, right? Going up against the territorial court system with no money and 10 days left?" "Yeah, I know. And you still want to try?" Rhea thought about the homestead, about the life they'd built together, about finally finding something worth fighting for and refusing to let it go without a fight. "Yeah, I still want to try." Gideon kissed her then, hard and desperate and full of everything they couldn't say. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Then let's burn it all down," he said. They spent the next 3 days reaching out to everyone they could think of. Marnie helped them contact other homesteaders who'd been targeted by Thorne. Word spread through the territory like wildfire. Someone was finally fighting back. People started showing up at their cabin, families who'd lost land, widows who'd been cheated. Men who'd barely escaped Thorne's trap. Each one brought their story, their documentation, their anger. By the end of the week, they had 23 people willing to testify. 40 documented cases of predatory lending, and enough collective fury to fuel a revolution. But they still needed a lawyer willing to take the case. Harold Chen refused, said it was too risky, too political, too likely to fail. They tried 3 other lawyers in the settlement. All said the same thing. Then Marnie mentioned a name. There's a woman lawyer 2 settlements over, Rebecca Walsh. She's got a reputation for taking cases nobody else will touch. A woman lawyer? Gideon sounded skeptical. You got a problem with that? Rhea shot back. No, just surprised there is one out here. They rode to the neighboring settlement and found Rebecca Walsh in a small office that looked like a tornado had hit it. She was younger than Rhea expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and ink stains on her fingers. Let me guess, Walsh said before they'd even introduced themselves. Silas Thorne. How did you know? Because I've been waiting for someone to come after him with enough ammunition to actually matter, and word spreading that you've got Dutch Reinhardt's documentation plus 24 new victims. She leaned forward. Tell me everything. They talked for 2 hours. Walsh asked pointed questions, took meticulous notes, and didn't sugarcoat the challenges. This is going to be ugly, she said finally. Thorne's got connections. The territorial court is corrupt. We're fighting the entire system. Can we win? Rhea asked. Maybe, if we're smart and lucky and the judge we draw isn't already in Thorne's pocket. Walsh tapped her pencil against her notepad. But even if we lose in territorial court, I can appeal to the federal circuit, take it all the way to the top if I have to. How much will this cost? Walsh named a figure that made Rhea's heart sink. $3,000. They had maybe $800 saved up from selling everything. I can't pay that, Rhea said quietly. I know, but I'll take the case anyway. Walsh smiled grimly. I've been waiting years for a shot at Thorne. This is it. We'll figure out payment later. Right now, we've got 7 days to build a case strong enough to bring down a corrupt system. They worked around the clock. Walsh filed emergency motions to freeze any property transfers pending investigation, submitted Dutch's documentation as evidence of a pattern of fraud, deposed witnesses, built a case that was equal parts legal precedent and righteous fury. Thorne fought back hard, filed countermotions, challenged every piece of evidence, tried to get the case dismissed on technicalities. But Walsh was relentless. She'd found her cause, and she wasn't backing down. 3 days before the deadline, they got their hearing. The territorial courthouse was packed. Every homesteader who'd been victimized by Thorne, every family fighting to keep their land, everyone who'd been waiting for someone to finally stand up to the system. The judge was a stern-faced man named Morrison, who looked at the crowd with obvious distaste. Walsh stood and presented their case with surgical precision. She laid out the pattern of predatory lending, showed how Thorne targeted desperate homesteaders, proved that in 40 documented cases, Thorne had loaned money knowing the borrowers couldn't repay, with the explicit intention of seizing their land. Then she dropped the real bomb, evidence that Judge Harrison, who'd dismissed Dutch Reinhardt's case, had himself been a Thorne debtor, that the ruling was corrupt and needed to be overturned. The courtroom erupted. Thorne's lawyer was on his feet, objecting. Judge Morrison was banging his gavel. The gallery was shouting. When order was finally restored, Morrison looked at Walsh with something like respect. Counselor, these are serious allegations. Accusations of judicial corruption don't get made lightly. I'm aware, Your Honor, which is why I have documentation, contracts, financial records, all proving. Judge Harrison had a conflict of interest when he ruled in Thorne's favor. Morrison studied the documents Walsh handed him. The courtroom held its collective breath. Finally, Morrison looked up. I'm ordering a full investigation into Judge Harrison's conduct, and pending the results of that investigation, I'm freezing all property transfers related to Silas Thorne's lending activities for the past 5 years. The courtroom exploded again, this time in triumph. Rhea grabbed Gideon's hand so hard her knuckles went white. Furthermore, Morrison continued, raising his voice over the noise, I'm referring this case to the federal prosecutor for potential criminal charges. Mr. Thorne, You're ordered to appear for questioning regarding allegations of fraud, corruption, and racketeering. Thorne's face had gone white. His lawyer was gathering papers frantically, already planning their defense. But it was too late. The dam had broken, and everything Thorne had built on lies and exploitation was about to come crashing down. Outside the courthouse, people surrounded Rhea and Gideon, thanking them, crying, celebrating. Sarah Reinhardt hugged Rhea so hard she could barely breathe. "You did it," Sarah whispered. "Dutch would be so proud." Walsh emerged from the courthouse looking exhausted but triumphant. "This isn't over. The investigation will take months. Thorne will fight every step. But we've got him on the defensive now." "What about our land?" Gideon asked. "The deadline. Frozen along with everything else. Your property is safe pending the investigation. And if the case goes the way I think it will, the debt will be invalidated entirely." Rhea felt tears burning in her eyes. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, with no money and no power, they'd found a way to fight back and win. That night, back at the homestead, Rhea and Gideon sat on the porch, watching the stars come out. The crisis wasn't completely over.
This story was
There
posted
still
on the channel The
investigation,
Rusty
still
Saddle.
uncertainty,
Please do not
still the long
repost it
legal
in any
battle
form.
ahead. But for the first time in weeks, they could breathe. "I thought we'd lost everything," Rhea said quietly. "So did I. You were ready to sacrifice it all, sell everything you'd built just to try to save us." Gideon took her hand. "It's not a sacrifice if it's for something that matters. And you matter, Rhea. More than land. More than anything." She turned to look at him in the starlight. This man who'd offered her survival and given her so much more. Who'd fought beside her when the world tried to take it all away. "I love you," she said. The words felt huge and terrifying and absolutely true. Gideon's breath caught. "Yeah? Yeah. I'm terrified of it. Terrified of how much. But I love you." He pulled her close, kissing her with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "I love you too. Have for months, just didn't want to push." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other while the mountain wind whispered through the pines and the stars wheeled overhead. They'd survived the winter, survived the threat to their home, survived every test thrown at them. And now, finally, they could stop just surviving and start actually living. The investigation took 4 months. 4 months of waiting, of uncertainty hanging over everything like a storm that wouldn't break. Rhea and Gideon went back to the rhythms of homestead life, but it all felt suspended somehow, like they were living in the pause between lightning and thunder. Rebecca Walsh called every few weeks with updates. The federal prosecutor was building a case. Thorne's financial records had been seized. Witnesses were being deposed. It was moving forward, but the law moved slow, grinding through procedure and bureaucracy while their lives hung in the balance. They found 12 other judges on Thorne's payroll, Walsh told them during one visit in late May. The corruption goes deeper than anyone thought. This is going to reshape the entire territorial court system. "What about our case specifically?" Gideon asked. "Still pending, but the prosecutor thinks they have enough to invalidate most of Thorne's contracts on fraud charges, your debt included." "Thinks?" Rhea caught the word. "Not knows?" "Nothing's certain until a judge rules, but I'd say we're looking at 90% odds in your favor." 90% should have felt reassuring. Instead, it just reminded Rhea that 10% chance of losing still existed, 10% chance they could still lose everything after all this. But they couldn't live in that fear. So they planted the garden, tended the animals, repaired winter damage to the cabin and barn. They worked side by side in the lengthening days, and at night they fell into bed exhausted and wrapped around each other like they could hold back the world through sheer force of will. One evening in early June, Rhea was pulling weeds when she felt it, a rolling sensation in her stomach that wasn't quite nausea, but wasn't normal either. She sat back on her heels, pressing a hand to her abdomen, and felt it again. She'd been tired lately, emotional. Her monthly courses had stopped 2 months ago, but she'd attributed it to stress. The body did strange things under pressure. She'd learned that the year after Thomas died, when her cycles had become irregular from near starvation. But this felt different. She didn't say anything to Gideon that night, didn't want to add another uncertainty to the pile they were already carrying. But the next morning, when the rolling sensation came back accompanied by actual nausea, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Marnie had mentioned a midwife in the settlement, a woman named Agnes who delivered half the babies in the territory. Rhea rode down alone the next day, telling Gideon she needed supplies from the trading post. Agnes was a large woman with gentle hands and no-nonsense eyes. She examined Rhea in her small cabin while asking questions in a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made the whole thing less terrifying. "You're about 3 months along," Agnes said finally. "Baby should come around December if my counting's right." Rhea sat there trying to process the words. A baby. She was going to have a baby. "You seem surprised," Agnes noted. I didn't think. With everything happening, I didn't pay attention to the signs." "That'll happen. Life gets loud, body's whispers get missed." Agnes washed her hands in a basin. "How are you feeling about it?" How was she feeling about it? Rhea didn't know. Terrified seemed like a starting point. Overwhelmed. But underneath that, something else. Something that felt almost like joy trying to break through the fear. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's fair. It's a lot to take in." Agnes dried her hands. "You're healthy. Baby seems healthy. Come see me once a month so I can check on you both. And tell that husband of yours. Men get weird when you keep secrets about babies." Rhea rode back to the homestead in a daze. A baby. In December. Right in the middle of winter. She'd be giving birth in the same season that had almost killed her alone in that broken cabin. But she wouldn't be alone this time. She'd have Gideon, have a home that was solid and warm, have everything she'd been fighting for, if they didn't lose it all in the investigation. She found Gideon in the barn, repairing a broken stall door. He looked up when she entered, immediately reading something in her expression. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I need to tell you something." He set down his tools, giving her his full attention. Rhea realized her hands were shaking. "I went to see the midwife today. Agnes." Gideon went very still. "Are you sick?" "No, I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Gideon's expression went through several changes: shock, confusion, then something that looked like wonder. "Pregnant?" he repeated. "About 3 months. Baby should come in December." He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could feel his heart hammering against her cheek. "We're having a baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, we are." Rhea pulled back to look at him. Is this okay? With everything else happening, with the investigation? Okay, Rhea, this is..." He seemed to struggle for words. "I never thought I'd have this. A family. Something to build toward that wasn't just survival. We might still lose the land. I don't care. We'll figure it out. We've figured out everything else." He cupped her face in his hands. "We're having a baby." The joy in his voice finally cracked through Rhea's fear. She started crying, which made her angry at herself, but Gideon just held her and let her cry it out. "I'm terrified, shit," she admitted when she could speak again. "Me too. What if I'm a terrible mother? What if something goes wrong? What if..." "Then we'll handle it. Same way we handle everything." He kissed her forehead. Together. They stood in the barn for a long time, just holding each other while the future rearranged itself around them. A baby. A family. A reason to fight that went beyond land and pride and everything else. That night, lying in bed with Gideon's hand resting on her still flat stomach, Rhea thought about Thomas, about the dreams he'd had that never materialized, about the future he'd promised that had died with him in the snow. This was different. This wasn't built on dreams and wishes. This was built on work and honesty and 2 people who'd looked at the worst life could throw at them and decided to keep going anyway. "What do you want?" Gideon asked quietly in the dark. "Boy or girl?" "Healthy. That's all I want." "Yeah, me too." He was quiet for a moment. "But if I'm being honest, I kind of hope it's a girl who looks like you. Stubborn and smart and doesn't take anyone's nonsense." Rhea smiled in the darkness. "And if it's a boy, then I hope he's nothing like me. Hope he's better." "You're pretty good, Gideon Hale." "I'm okay. But our kid's going to be extraordinary. News of the pregnancy spread through their small community faster than Rhea expected. Marnie showed up with baby clothes her own grandchildren had outgrown. Sarah Reinhardt brought a hand-carved cradle her Dutch had made years ago. Other families they'd barely known before the fight against Thorn appeared with offers of help, supplies, advice. "You brought people together," Marnie said one afternoon while helping Rhea preserve vegetables for winter. Gave them something to believe in when they'd stopped believing the system could work for people like us. "We just fought back, that's all. That's everything. Most people give up when the world tells them they can't win. You didn't." Marnie sealed another jar with practiced efficiency. "That baby you're carrying? They're going to grow up in a territory you helped make a little more fair. That matters." Rhea wanted to believe her, wanted to believe they'd made a difference beyond just saving their own land. But the investigation was still ongoing, and until it concluded, everything felt uncertain. The summons came in mid-July, final hearing scheduled for August 15th. The prosecutor had filed formal charges against Silas Thorne for fraud, racketeering, and corruption. Judge Morrison would hear arguments and issue a ruling that would determine the validity of every contract Thorne had written in the past decade. "This is it," Walsh told them when she brought the news. "Everything comes down to this hearing. Win, and you're free. Lose, and—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The weeks leading up to the hearing felt like slowly drowning. Rhea couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, couldn't focus on anything except the dates circled on their calendar. Even the baby, growing steadily inside her, couldn't completely distract from the anxiety. Gideon was quieter than usual, his worry showing in the way he worked, harder, longer, like he could somehow control the outcome through sheer physical effort. 3 days before the hearing, Rhea woke in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed empty. She found him outside, sitting on the porch steps, staring at the mountains silhouetted against the stars. "Can't sleep?" she asked, settling beside him. "Keep thinking about what happens if we lose. We start over, find another place. With what money? We sold everything to fight this. We've got maybe $200 left." Rhea took his hand. "Then we start with $200. We've both started with less. You'd be pregnant, trying to establish a new homestead while carrying a baby. Rhea, that could kill you." "So could a lot of things. I'm not dying that easy." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight she could see the fear he usually kept hidden. "I can't lose this. Can't lose you, the baby, everything we've built. I won't survive it." "Yes, you will, because that's what we do. We survive, and then we do more than survive." She squeezed his hand. "But we're not going to lose. I can feel it. You can't know that." "No, but I can believe it, and right now, that's enough." They sat together until dawn, watching the skies slowly lighten from black to gray to gold. When the sun finally broke over the mountains, Gideon stood and pulled Rhea to her feet. "Okay," he said. "We believe." The courthouse was even more packed for the final hearing than it had been for the preliminary. Every homesteader who'd been victimized by Thorn was there. The gallery was standing room only, people pressed shoulder to shoulder, all waiting to see if justice would finally be served. Thorn sat at the defendant's table with his lawyers, looking smaller than Rhea remembered. The investigation had aged him. His face was drawn, his suit hung loose, and there was a defeated slump to his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Judge Morrison entered and everyone stood. He was an imposing figure, this man who held their future in his hands. "Be seated," he said. "We're here for final arguments in the matter of the territory versus Silas Thorne, with related civil claims from 43 plaintiffs. Prosecution, you may proceed." The federal prosecutor stood, a sharp woman named Catherine Brennan, who'd spent the last 4 months building the case against Thorne. She laid it out methodically. The pattern of predatory lending, the kickbacks to judges, the deliberate targeting of desperate homesteaders, the seizure of land worth far more than the original loans. She called witnesses, homesteaders who'd lost everything, financial experts who testified about the fraudulent nature of the contracts, a handwriting analyst who proved Thorne had forged documents, and then she called Rhea. Walking to the witness stand felt like moving through water. Ria's hand shook as she swore to tell the truth. Her voice wavered when Brennan asked her to describe what had happened, but then she looked out at the gallery, saw Gideon watching her with absolute faith in his eyes, saw Sarah Reinhardt and Marnie and all the others who'd been victimized, saw the baby cradle waiting at home for the child growing inside her, and her voice steadied. She told the truth. All of it. About Thomas's gambling, about the debt she'd inherited, about nearly dying alone that first winter, about Gideon's proposal and their marriage and building a life together only to have Thorne threaten to take it all away. He preys on desperate people, Ria said, looking directly at Thorne. He waits until they're at their lowest and then he offers them hope. But it's not real hope. It's a trap, and by the time you realize it, you've already lost everything. Brennan nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Hale. No further questions. Thorne's lawyer tried to cross-examine, tried to paint Ria as an opportunist who'd married Gideon to escape her debts. But Walsh objected at every turn, and Morrison sustained most of them. When Ria finally stepped down, she felt hollowed out, but also lighter somehow. Like she'd been carrying the weight of Thomas's mistakes for so long that finally speaking them out loud had released something. The hearing lasted all day. Arguments and counter-arguments, technical legal points that Ria barely understood. By the time Morrison called for a recess to make his decision, the sun was setting and everyone was exhausted. How long until he rules? Gideon asked Walsh. Could be hours, could be days. Morrison's thorough. They waited in a small room off the courthouse, along with Sarah and Marnie and a dozen other homesteaders. Nobody talked much. There was nothing left to say. At 9 o'clock that night, Morrison's clerk summoned them back to the courtroom. The judge looked tired as he took his seat. He shuffled papers for a moment, then looked out at the packed gallery. I've reviewed all evidence and testimony presented, he said. This case represents one of the most extensive patterns of fraud and corruption I've encountered in my 30 years on the bench. Ria's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Thorne engaged in systematic predatory lending with the explicit purpose of seizing property from desperate homesteaders. Furthermore, he corrupted multiple territorial judges to ensure favorable rulings when his victims attempted to fight back in court. Morrison's voice was hard as granite. Therefore, I am ruling in favor of the prosecution. All contracts issued by Silas Thorne in the past 10 years are hereby declared fraudulent and void. All property seized under these contracts is to be returned to the original owners. Mr. Thorne, you are found guilty of fraud, racketeering, corruption, and conspiracy. You will be remanded to federal custody pending sentencing. The courtroom exploded. People were crying, shouting, embracing. Someone started singing. The noise was deafening. Ria just sat there, unable to move, unable to process what she'd just heard. Void. The debt was void. The land was theirs. Gideon pulled her into his arms, and she felt him shaking, or maybe that was her. Maybe they were both shaking, both crying, both trying to believe this was real. We won, he said, his voice breaking. We actually won. Morrison was banging his gavel, trying to restore order, but nobody was listening. This wasn't just a verdict. This was vindication. This was justice for everyone Thorne had victimized. This was proof that sometimes, against all odds, the people who kept fighting could win. Walsh found them in the chaos, her professional composure completely shattered. She was crying and laughing at the same time. You did it, she kept saying. You actually did it. We did it, Ria corrected. We all did. Outside the courthouse, the celebration continued. Someone had brought whiskey. Someone else had a fiddle. Impromptu music and dancing broke out in the street. People who'd been strangers before bonded by shared trauma and shared victory. Sarah Reinhardt hugged Ria so hard it hurt. Dutch would have loved this. Would have loved seeing Thorne's face when Morrison read that verdict. We couldn't have done it without his documentation, Ria said. No, you couldn't have. But he couldn't have done it alone either. Took all of us. Sarah wiped her eyes. That's the lesson, isn't it? One person can't beat a corrupt system, but a whole community fighting together? That's different. Rhea thought about that as she and Gideon finally extracted themselves from the celebration and started the long ride home. One person couldn't have done this. She couldn't have survived that first winter alone, couldn't have fought Thorn alone, couldn't have built the life she had now alone. It had taken Gideon offering partnership, Marnie offering support, Sarah sharing Dutch's work, Walsh fighting the legal battle, an entire community of people who'd decided that enough was enough. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked as they rode through the darkness. "That I used to think strength meant not needing anyone, being able to survive alone no matter what. And now? Now I think real strength is knowing when to ask for help, knowing when to let people in." She looked at him. "You taught me that." "Pretty sure you taught me the same thing." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the stars bright overhead, the mountains dark shapes against the sky. "What do we do now?" Rhea asked. "Now, we go home. We finish planting the garden. We get ready for winter and for the baby. We live." Just live. Just live. No more fighting for survival. No more courts and lawyers and wondering if we'll lose everything. Just life. The normal, boring, beautiful kind. Rhea rested a hand on her stomach, feeling the small flutter of movement that had become familiar. "I don't know how to do normal. Neither do I. I guess we'll figure it out together." "Together," Rhea agreed. The homestead looked perfect when they finally reached it in the early morning hours. The cabin stood solid and square, smoke curling from the chimney where they'd left the stove banked. The barn and chicken coop and garden plot all exactly as they'd left them. Except now they were truly theirs. No debt hanging over them. No threat of loss, just land and home and future stretching out ahead. Gideon helped Rhea down from her horse, his hands gentle on her waist, mindful of the baby. They stood there for a moment, just looking at what they'd fought so hard to keep. "I love you," Gideon said. "I don't say it enough, but I do. Love you more than I knew I could love anything. I love you too, even when you're stubborn and impossible and drive me crazy. Especially then? Especially then." He kissed her, soft and sweet, and Rhea felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe. Or contentment. Or just the simple knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They went inside and Gideon built up the fire while Rhea made coffee. Simple domestic actions that felt profound after everything they'd been through. This was what they'd fought for. Not grand romance or dramatic gestures, but this quiet partnership. This everyday choosing of each other. Summer rolled into fall and Rhea's belly grew round with the baby. She moved slower, tired easier, but felt stronger than she had in years. Gideon was protective to the point of being ridiculous, trying to do all the heavy work himself until Rhea threatened to hit him with a skillet if he didn't let her help with the harvest. "I'm pregnant, not broken," she told him for the 100th time. "I know, but what if nothing? Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, most of them while doing much harder work than this." But she let him hover anyway, because it came from love and worry, and she understood both of those things intimately. The community came together for the harvest, dozens of families helping each other bring in crops and prepare for winter. It was different this year, celebration mixed with the work. Everyone knew what they'd accomplished together. Everyone felt the change. "It's not just about beating Thorn," Marnie said one evening while they were canning vegetables. "It's about remembering we can fight back, that we don't have to accept corruption and cruelty as just the way things are." "You think it'll last?" Rhea asked. "The unity?" "For a while. Then people will drift back to their own concerns, their own problems. That's human nature." Marnie sealed another jar. "But they'll remember this. And next time someone tries to take advantage, they'll remember that fighting back is possible." November came with the first serious snow. Rhea watched it fall from the window, one hand on her belly, where the baby was doing acrobatics, and felt no fear. The cabin was solid, the stores were full, the woodpile was high, and Gideon was beside her, his arm around her shoulders, equally content. "You ready?" he asked. "For the baby?" "No, terrified, actually." "Me too, but we'll figure it out." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." Labor started on a bitter cold night in mid-December. Rhea woke to contractions that took her breath away and immediately knew this was it. "Gideon," she gasped, shaking him awake. "It's time." He was up instantly, pulling on clothes, building up the fire, doing all the things they'd planned for this moment. He'd ridden down to the settlement the week before and brought back Agnes the midwife, who'd been staying in their spare room waiting for this moment. Agnes took one look at Rhea and nodded. "Let's have this baby." The next 12 hours were the hardest of Rhea's life. Harder than the winter alone. Harder than fighting Thorn. Harder than anything. But Gideon was there the whole time, holding her hand, letting her curse at him, telling her she was strong enough to do this. "I can't," she sobbed at one point, exhausted beyond measure. "You can. You're the strongest person I know. I'm not. You survived a winter that should have killed you. You fought a corrupt system and won. You can do this." And somehow, impossibly, she did. The baby came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious, and Agnes placed the tiny squirming body on Rhea's chest. "It's a girl," Agnes announced. "Healthy lungs on this one." Rhea looked down at her daughter, this impossible, beautiful thing she'd created, and felt something break open in her chest. Love so fierce it was almost painful. Gideon was crying openly, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger, awed. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's ours," Rhea said, and that felt like the most important truth in the world. They named her Hope, not because it was profound or meaningful, but because it was simple and true. She was their hope made flesh, their future given form. That first night, Rhea lay in bed with Hope sleeping on her chest, and Gideon curled around them both, protective and gentle. Outside, the winter wind howled, but inside they were warm and safe and whole. "Thank you," Rhea said softly. "For what?" "For asking me to marry you. For giving me a reason to keep fighting. For this." She gestured at the baby, at the cabin, at everything they'd built. "Thank you for saying yes. For seeing past the crazy proposal to what I was really offering." "What were you really offering?" "Partnership, honesty, a chance to stop dying and start living." Rhea thought about that. About the woman she'd been a year and a half ago, splitting wood with a broken axe, ready to give up. About the journey from there to here. About all the ways survival had transformed into something bigger. "I was so scared of this," she admitted. "Of letting myself care. Of building something that could be taken away. And now? Now I'm still scared, but I'm more scared of what I'd miss if I let fear make my decisions." She looked down at Hope, tiny and trusting. She's going to grow up in a world where her mother fought back, where her parents didn't accept injustice, where love wasn't about grand gestures but about showing up every day and doing the work. That's a good world to grow up in. Yeah, it is. Winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin there was warmth and light, and the sound of a baby learning what her voice could do. Rhea healed slowly, her body recovering from the trauma of birth. Gideon took over most of the work, caring for the animals and maintaining the homestead while Rhea focused on feeding Hope and sleeping in stolen moments. It was exhausting and frustrating and perfect. By the time spring came again, Hope was 4 months old and starting to smile. Real smiles, not just gas, that lit up her whole face. She had Rhea's dark hair and Gideon's gray eyes and a stubborn temperament that promised she'd be a handful. Rhea carried her outside one warm April morning and stood in the yard showing her the mountains, the valley, the world she'd been born into. "This is home," Rhea told her daughter. "This is the place your father built and your mother fought for and we're keeping for you. You're going to grow up here learning that life is hard, but you're harder. That systems can be corrupt, but people can fight back. That love isn't easy or perfect, but it's worth it anyway." Hope gurgled, unimpressed by the speech, more interested in trying to eat her own fist. Gideon came to stand beside them, still sweaty from working in the barn. Giving her the full orientation? Something like that. He put his arm around Rhea's shoulders, and they stood together looking at their land, their home, their future. It wasn't perfect. The cabin still needed repairs. Money was tight. There would be hard winters ahead and challenges they couldn't predict. But they had each other. They had this stubborn, squirming baby who'd already mastered the art of sleeping through nothing and waking at the worst possible moments. They had a community that had learned the power of fighting together. They had a future they'd claimed instead of having it handed to them. "You ever regret it?" Rhea asked. "That first proposal? Taking a chance on a desperate widow with nothing to offer but problems?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, considering. "Not once. Not even on the hard days. You?" "Not once," Rhea echoed. "Even when you're driving me crazy." Which is often. Very often. They smiled at each other, and Rhea thought about all the ways she'd been wrong about love. She'd thought it was about perfection, about smooth sailing, about never fighting or struggling, but real love was messier than that. It was choosing someone even when things got hard. It was showing up every day and doing the work. It was building something together that was stronger than what either person could build alone. Hope started fussing, ready for her feeding. Rhea carried her inside, Gideon following. They'd cycle through another day of the mundane tasks that made up a life: feeding, cleaning, working, resting. Nothing dramatic or cinematic, just the ordinary work of living. And that was enough. That was everything. Because Rhea had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the happy ending isn't about the grand gesture or the perfect moment. Sometimes it's just about surviving long enough to build something real. About finding someone who sees you clearly, flaws and strengths and everything between, and chooses you anyway. About creating a life that's honest and hard and worth fighting for. She'd come to this mountain alone and desperate, ready to marry a stranger just to survive the winter. She'd expected practicality, maybe partnership if she was lucky. What she'd found was so much more. She'd found home. She'd found love. She'd found her own strength reflected back at her through someone else's eyes. She'd found a community worth fighting for and a future worth building. And standing in the cabin she now shared with the man she loved and the daughter they'd created, watching spring sunshine stream through clean windows, Rhea Calloway. Hale finally understood what it meant to be more than just alive. It meant having something to lose, having people who mattered, having a stake in tomorrow. It meant being terrified and hopeful in equal measure. It meant choosing every single day to keep fighting for the life you wanted instead of settling for the one you thought you deserved. It meant survival wasn't the end goal anymore. Living was, and she was living now. Fully, completely, messily, beautifully alive in ways she'd forgotten were possible. The winter that was supposed to kill her had given her everything instead. And that, Rhea thought as Hope latched on to Nurse and Gideon settled beside them reading crop reports. That was the real miracle. Not the dramatic rescue or the courtroom victory or even the baby herself. The miracle was the ordinary moments after, the quiet mornings and shared work and simple choice to keep building something together. The miracle was this: two broken people had found each other, and instead of breaking further, they'd helped each other heal. And in a hard land that didn't forgive mistakes, in a territory built on loneliness and struggle, they'd created something that would last. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real.